portion this Shabbat. Like, really one of my faves. It is the Parsha with the talking donkey. It is the Parsha with angels an angel appearing that makes the aforementioned talking donkey suddenly stop. It is got magic, it's got blessings, it's got curses, it's got our ancestors in the desert complaining, it's got all of the component pieces of one excellent story from our Parsha, but it also contains the very famous line, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. It is called Balak, one of these 6 Torah portions named after a person. But Balak was the king of Moab. He was not an Israelite or a Canaanite. He was a Moabite. And the Moabites, who's a famous Moabite, by the way? Very famous Moabite who gives birth to someone who gives birth to someone who gives birth to someone who gives birth to King David. Ruth, that is correct. Ruth is a famous Moabite. Yes, Naomi was close, but she was an Israelite. But she was her mother-in-law, so in the family. The Moabites are, for the most part, enemies. They're not friendlies. The Edomites, who the Israelites also experience, actually had some bad things befall them. They tried to fight the Israelites leaving Egypt. The Edomites are the descendants of Esau, by the way, just so we can put them all back to other characters that we're more familiar with. So the Moabite king, Balak, gets very, very scared that these Israelites are coming through on their way to the Promised Land, and he calls for a magician named Balaam, and I know this is all coming back to you, and asks Balaam to use his magic spells and go and curse the Israelites so that they will not only not bother the Moabites, but because he's very, very, very scared that once they occupy the land of Israel, Canaan at that point, but soon to be Israel, that they will be a force to be reckoned with because their God is really, really strong and powerful. Word had spread from Egypt and what had happened to the Pharaoh, to all of these kingdoms, and none of their kings were very happy about having these new neighbors. Nothing changes, as it turns out. So here we are. You know the basic story that Balaam goes to curse the Israelites and ends up blessing the Israelites, but there's a very important line in this Parsha that I want us to think about and consider, especially with what's happening in society and the world around us. I've been reading and listening to a professor named Jordan Peterson. I'm sure some of you have heard of Jordan Peterson before. Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, clinical psychologist, but also has a PhD in psychology and teaches at a university level in Toronto. And Dr. Peterson got very famous on, and by way of YouTube, actually. He started a few years ago to record his lectures to his students in his class, and then sent them out on YouTube. But it wasn't necessarily the lectures that made him famous or infamous, because he's very controversial. One of the things that makes him so controversial is he is a very staunch freedom of speecher. So much so that what he has seen going on in the universities, not only in Canada, but throughout the North American continent, scares him a lot, with the safe spaces and the PC movement, and you can only say what you can say as defined by, your academics. And when Toronto passed an ordinance, or was in the process of passing an ordinance that would make it basically a crime to not call someone by the pronoun they ask you to call them, someone who's transgender, by not calling them the pronoun that they ask, that would be a crime. If someone says, I'd like you to refer to me as she, and you refer to them as he, or vice versa. Or in the last few years, a lot of people in the transgender community want to be called they, actually. So there's that whole, syntax thing about calling someone in the first person and the third person plural. But his point wasn't that I won't call a student what they request to be called. His point was, you cannot legislate it. You cannot legislate what words I use, how I speak. That made him very famous, or infamous, as it turns out. And then, because of his sort of anti-PC, anti-politically correct stance on so many positions, unfortunately, and I think he would be the first one, well, he wouldn't be the first one, he is the first one to say this, unfortunately, the alt-right has attached to him as their great thinker. In other words, because the alt-right is incredibly limited in what they think, I mean, that's sort of part of being the alt-right, is this very rigid interpretation. You believe what I believe, and what they say about race and what they say about gender, right? They think he's talking about them. But he's not, and he's actually, if you really, really listen, apolitical, but has become sort of political. But this idea that he really discusses, and I'm really playing around with this a lot because I know how controversial he is to a lot of people, but I have found it to be very fascinating because a lot of his psychological observations are based in science, not in anecdote. One of the things that he talks a lot about is this idea that we're all experiencing now, which is this concept of tribalism, that people want to put what they are and who they associate with in tribal terms before or as more important as part of their identity than anything or anyone else. In other words, tribalism is at the core that concept that I identify as part of an individual group, and that individual group's, how you speak to the individual group and their rights and their I guess you would say entitlements are more important above anything else. It's sort of at the foundation what politically correct is about, right? Like, if I identify as fill in the blank, let's say for us, I identify as a Jew, so anything in society that I even perceive, whether it's real or not, as anti-Semitic, is not just bad, but makes you as a person, what you say or do, worthy of me destroying you, right? Of charging you with libel, of destroying you, of calling you an anti-Semite, even if your intentions weren't anti-Semitic. There's sort of the, what do I call, the emotion, someone called them emotional hemophiliacs, which is to say, if you hurt my feelings, then you're a racist. If you hurt my feelings, then you're homophobic. If you hurt my feelings, then, or that of my tribe, those of my tribe, you're anti-Semitic. All right, so I didn't explain it that well, but that's basically what the concept is. The problem for us as Jews, especially in America, is, are we Jewish Americans or American Jews? Which is the age-old question of tribalism versus being part of the general society. Are we American first or are we Jews first? Jews are very tribal, not only because we had 12 of them in the Torah, but because we identify ourselves as part of a larger group called the Jewish people. And when you mess with one Jew, you mess with all of us, right? But that kind of is at best, contrast with, and at worst, conflict with the general society. And that's something we've been playing around with all the time since we've been in North America, specifically, is what comes first and what part of our identity. That's all a long way of saying something that's illustrated in this Parsha. Because the problem that Balaam has with cursing the Israelites is articulated to Balak, his boss, the guy who hired him for this job, in this narrative. He asks a rhetorical question. Balaam is told to go curse the Israelites, and as the story unfolds, in order to fulfill his mission, he has to go and say really nasty things about the Israelites. Not only that they shouldn't make it successfully to Canaan, but that they should basically die out. He ends up, of course, the punchline saying, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov. But as the story unfolds, he has this epiphany with the talking donkey. I promise you I'm getting to the point now. And instead of cursing the Israelites, as I said, he blesses them. He says the following, how can I damn or curse those whom God has not damned, not cursed? How do I doom when God has not doomed? In other words, how do I curse these people who are God's people, who are on God's crew? How do I do that? God hasn't damned them. In fact, God's chosen them, done the opposite. As I see them from the mountaintops, Balaam continues, gaze on them from the heights, he says, this is the big line, there is a people that dwells alone. Part of what it means to be, in the commentaries, part of what this means is that we as Jews have sort of two destinies. One is to be God's chosen people, and the second destiny is to do that, to be God's chosen people or in covenant by God, by separating ourselves, by being tribal, because we're in covenant, right? If you're married to your partner, to your spouse, you are in covenant with them, meaning I have a responsibility to them, they have a responsibility to me, unlike any responsibility that I have to anyone else. That's why I don't date, for example, when I'm married. So several commentaries explain that this idea of dwelling alone was a blessing that Balaam perceived and used that blessing to bless the people. In other words, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. He uses both the identity of Jacob and Israel, both sides of Jacob and Israel, to bless the people. But he also uses there's a prophetic message in it, which is we are different. We Jews are different than anyone else. Why is that prophetic? Well, you look at history. You study history. Have we ever really fit in to the greater society before we came to the United States? Have we ever fit in anywhere? Have we been invited to fit in? Have we been asked to have a seat at the table? Have we been given citizenship? And the answer is no. Outside of being in the land of Israel in biblical times up until the Roman destruction, the Israelites, the Jewish people, have never fit in. We have, the Hebrew words, yidvenu libo. We have dwelled alone. But the question I want to ask you on this Shabbat is, does that mean that we are not anti, that's a little bit too strong. Does that idea run contrary now that we're finally in a place where we fit in? And that's only a recent development. Don't forget, my generation was the first generation that was allowed to go to university anywhere if you were Jewish or join a country. We always use the two examples, university and country clubs. But my generation was the first generation where you didn't have to worry about anti-Semitism preventing you from attending a university, from getting into clubs, from being part of the larger whole. That's been the case since the 1950s. The question I want to ask you on this Shabbat, going back to the Jordan Peterson and going back to tribalism versus group identity, because I think that one of the things we can agree on is that identity politics in the country is not good. It's not good, right? It's not good to have policy or rules that only address tribal factions within the country, or protect, I should say, tribal factions within the country. At some point, that gets a little out of control. When you start to legislate and make it illegal for you to use the pronouns that you choose to use, whether it's right or wrong is not the issue, by the way. I think it's wrong not to refer to someone by the pronoun that they ask you to call them. I think that's totally wrong. But should it be illegal? When you start to do that, are you separating yourself? Is what Balaam says, that this group is separate or stands alone, this group never will fit in, are these ideas that we're living out today, regardless of your community, if you're a person of color, or if you are Jewish, or if you are a woman, or if you see what's going on in the counter argument to that, by the way. You see the overreaction on the other side of the equation. But there is a responsibility that we have as Jews to both stand alone and fit in and use our Jewishness, or act with our Jewishness, in ways to heal the world. Who are we? Are we American? Are we Jews? Are we tribal? Are we community-minded? Is Jewish uniqueness a blessing or a curse? Like, we're the ones who get it, I think, better than anyone. I don't mean that in a superior way. I think Jews get this idea of fitting in and being tribal versus being part of a larger whole better than anyone else. On this Shabbat, I want us to think about Balaam's description of a people that dwells alone. It rings very true. We can feel countercultural to our American condition because modernity makes it virtually impossible for many Jews to define being alone as anything other than a curse. But is it a blessing or a curse? And is tribalism as a concept, but also as a societal construct, good or bad? I'm not going to answer those questions. I mean, I have strong feelings about it. But on this Shabbat, I want us, because I've been going on a little long now, I want us to think about these things. Because I think that our country is a chaotic mess right now. And I think part of that is the identity politics piece, and part of it is the tribalism piece, and part of it is, really, most of it is just utter and complete lack of moral leadership. I think that isn't a jab at any one person, but all of them. And the people who could provide us moral leadership, as it turns out, are quitting in record numbers, at least from the federal side of things. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Congress, you've got all these people just saying, I can't do this anymore. It's not that they don't want to run for election again, which they don't. It's really, they just don't want to do it anymore because it's so dirty. And it's so zero-sum. And it's so about winning and losing and no longer about right and wrong. I think those are some of the reasons and some of the things that we can think about as we enter the Shabbat. I know it doesn't necessarily sound like a good Shabbistic kind of thing to do, but I think it's important, and I think it's definitely a topic worth engaging. Tomorrow morning, just a shameless plug at Torah Study, we're going to look a little bit more specifically at actually a very beautiful text about this idea of the people who dwells alone and what that means on a spiritual, higher spiritual level. As we enter the 4th of July, and we, I think, should contemplate what it means to be independent and what it means to be free, let us also think